Hi, I'm Nancy Scott with Masterpiece Quilting, and I am so excited you joined me for this video tutorial from Annie's. Today, I'll be making the Stars and Spools Quilt that was designed by Wendy Sheppard. This scrap-friendly quilt features two different blocks, the Ohio Star block and the Spool Block, and I'll be guiding you step by step in how to make both of them. Some of the techniques that we're going to be covering include making quarter square triangle units, framing a block, making stitch and flip corners, squaring a block to size, as well as troubleshooting what happens when your block isn't the correct size, and how to make a piece border. There is a lot to cover, so let's get started now. As we get ready to start making the Stars and Spools quilt, first thing we need to do is check out our materials list. And we've got it here on the pattern. We're going to be working with either 16 fat quarters or 2 1/4 yards total of assorted prints. So if you want to pull stash fabrics, this is a perfect quilt for using up lots of stash fabrics, and that is exactly what I did. We'll also need white solid, light blue solid, and then some binding fabric. And you can pick the binding fabric kind of based off the assortment of colors that you use for the blocks. One thing that I do want to note for you when you're pulling stash fabrics, so many times we have that question, is this piece big enough? So go ahead and hop over into your cutting instructions because it gives you some specific details. We've got some sets that we're going to be cutting where we've got squares all coming from the same fabric so that we get a cohesive look in our block, and then also strip sets that are matching. So that's going to tell you real quickly whether or not your piece is big enough. For instance, a little piece like this, not going to be big enough to get all of the squares or the strips out of it that we need that are in the same colorway. So that's a really fast way for you to know as you're pulling fabrics going, is this one big enough? Is to hop into those cutting instructions and take a look at that. While we're talking about stash fabrics, true confession, folks, my stash fabrics are not nicely, neatly organized. They're plopped into totes. And when they come out, you know what? They can be a little wrinkly. So one of the first things that I do when I'm working with stash fabrics before I even begin cutting them is to go through, sort them out, and do a quick press on them. So iron, and many times I end up using some type of a spray on them. If you've got a steam iron, that's perfectly fine, but something that's going to get all those wrinkles out. This happens to be an ironing spray, a starch or starch alternative, anything that's going to get that fabric nice and flat so that it doesn't have any wrinkles in it so you can get some accurate cuts. That's always essential when you're working with stash fabrics. The cutting instructions on this quilt are really pretty straightforward. We want to keep our light colored sets together so that way when we get ready to start in piecing, it'll be really efficient. One of the ways that you can do this is just pin them together. That works well. I've got all of them cut here that I need. Just stick a pin in them. If the stack is too big, wonder clips, just clipping them together. Whatever works, but that way you're not having to sort through all of your fabrics, your cut fabrics, trying to figure out what you need for a specific block. Always cut your largest pieces first. That way you can use the leftovers and cut the smaller pieces from it. And at some stage, you're just kind of going to make a decision on how much do I want to keep of my scrap fabric. I normally, if it's smaller than a 2.5 inch square, I go ahead and discard it. I don't do a lot of work with pieces smaller than that. If you know that you do, then by all means keep that. And as we are cutting, labeling is also important. I go pretty old school on this. Nothing super fancy, just a pen, scrap piece of paper, label it. In this case, these are my D squares. I've got a D and I drew a little square on that. So that is a really fast way just to label out exactly what the pieces are. This works well if you're sewing in time blocks, which I'm guilty of that too. That many times we'll go through and we'll be doing all of our cutting, but we know we're not going to be into sewing until later, or we're going to be sewing in time segments, an hour here, 2 hours there, a little bit of a spurt on a weekend. By going through and labeling everything, L square, K strips, that lets you know exactly what the pieces are, and it saves you time when you do get ready to start sewing. Now that we've covered our materials lists and our cutting instructions, next we're going to start working on the blocks. The first block that we're going to make is the Ohio Star block. And this is a very traditional block, one that is very, very common in quilts, and one that is really actually pretty deceptively easy to make. It may look a little complex with all of those crisscross points, but it really is pretty easy. So we're going to go ahead and follow the instructions. I have got my C and D squares, and I want to be on the wrong side, and I'm going to draw a diagonal line from corner to corner. I'm going to use my cutting grid. Any straight edge will work, but we're just going to position this corner to corner and draw a straight line. And this is going to be our guideline as we're stitching. I used a pencil, and the reason I did that was I want to make sure that you can see that line well here on camera. Typically, I'd be using a fabric-friendly marker when I'm doing this, but many times that line is a little bit fainter. So I just grabbed a pencil to make sure that you can see exactly where I'm drawing. I am going to pair right sides together, and the option is yours. If you feel more comfortable, go ahead and grab a pen and just put in the center of this, so that way we're holding all of our edges together. Next, we're going to be stitching, and we want to stitch 1/4 of an inch on each side of that drawn line. And accuracy is important here. If you're struggling getting that 1/4 of an inch lined up exactly the way it should be, err on the scant side. So a little bit closer to the drawn line than further away from it. That's going to help make sure that your block turns out to be the correct size. It's always easier to trim a little bit extra off than it is to put fabric back on, because that just doesn't work. But I've used a contrasting color thread so you can see it. So we've got a stitch line coming down this way. I just flip her around and then stitch back on the other side. And what we're going to do is cut that apart on the drawn line. So I'm going to line up here with my cutting grid. Again, corner to corner, and cut. So now we have 2 identical units. I'm going to press those with the seam allowance going towards the dark side. That way we don't have to worry about any of the darker fabric shadowing underneath the white fabric as we're working with this. These are what are called half square triangle units. So we have our half square triangle units made. Now what we want to do is stitch them together to make our 1/4 square triangle units. So again, I'm going to draw a diagonal line on the wrong side. This time we're going across the seam, so perpendicular to the seam. Doesn't have to be super dark. I'm making it a little bit darker just so it's easy to see on camera. But we've got that line drawn. Now we want to position these so that they are going opposite directions. Not so that we have pink on pink, but so that we have white on pink and pink on white. And what we are going to do is work these seams. And you can kind of feel these 2 seams nesting together. That's why we wanted to make sure that we had our fabrics pressed, both of them going towards the dark, so that when we get done, we can nest those 2 seams together. Once I get that adjusted, our corners should line up exactly. In this case, I definitely want to put a pin because it's really important to maintain that center point. So I'm going to put a pin right there. Exact same process as we did earlier. 1/4 inch seam on both sides of the drawn line. Stitch down one side, flip it on your sewing machine, stitch back on the other side. And we've got opposite colors. I'm going to position that. And cut. And now we have 2 units that look like this. These are our 1/4 square triangles. So we've got a square, 1/4, 4 triangles make up that square. Now we're going to need to press these. And what I prefer to do is actually to press this seam open. So that way we're distributing the bulk as much as possible. If we press to one side, then we've got lots of bulk in a couple areas. So I'm going to press those seams open real quick. Just starting them with my fingers. Sometimes just holding a little bit of heat on there gives it a nice even press. So we have our 2/4 inch or 1/4 square triangles made. We need to trim those to 2.5 inches square. I have my cutting grid. And one of the things that we want to make sure as we're trimming this is that we keep the center point right here in the center. So I don't want to just even up on one side and trim and then trim a whole bunch off of a scant amount off 2 sides and then a lot off the other sides. I need to make sure that I have this centered. So a little bit of math here. 2.5 divided by 2, that's going to be 1 1/4. So I want my 1 1/4 and 1 1/4 aligned right on that center point. I've got a diagonal line, 45-degree diagonal on my cutting grid. I'm using that right on that seam line. Going to trim 2 sides. Rotate. I'm going to line back up on my center, 1 1/4, 1 1/4, and make sure that we are at 2.5 and 2.5. There we go. And trim. And now we have our 2.5 inch 1/4 square triangle. This is our CD unit. And we're going to be making a number of those, but we're going to need 4 of them in the same colorway to make our block. And that moves us into figure 2. And I've went ahead and arranged and stitched, but we're putting these together into rows. Got our 1/4 square triangle unit. Let me get him going the right orientation there. We have our B squares here on the corners. We have our A square in the center. We're going to stitch that into 3 rows, and then we're going to join those rows together. And that's going to be the center section of our Ohio Star block. Next, figure 3 has us adding frames onto that. So we'll be stitching strips on both sides, on our 2 of our sides. And when we get that done, we're going to finish out stitching strips on both the top and the bottom. And that's going to be what we call framing. So we've got our block here in the center. This technically is the Ohio Star block, but then we're adding what's called framing, or extra pieces around it that's going to frame it. Gives it a little bit more of it's a little bit more white space when it's in the quilt. And when we get finished stitching those on, we will end up with our block that looks like this. And this block needs to measure 6.5 by 6.5 inches square. It finishes at 6 by 6, but we still need those 1/4 inch margins on both sides. So what I want to do is make sure, oh, excuse me, we're finishing at 8.5 by 8.5. Goodness. Center section was 6 by 6, adding the frames on us takes us to 8 by 8. There we go. So I want to make sure that we are squared up and that we're trimming this out evenly. 8.5 by divided by 2 is going to be 4 1/4. I'm using a 6.5 inch cutting grid, but I can still square up. But I want to put my 4 1/4 line right here going through the center intersections, and also using one of the inch lines. I'm lining that up on a seam line. So I've got 4 1/4, 1, 2, 3, 4 1/4 lined up right there, right here, making sure that my seam lines are lined up. And then I'm just going to trim any extra that was along that edge. I'm going to rotate it around, do the same thing on the opposite side, lining up quarter, quarter, making sure that my lines are even going across. We're going to trim just a little bit off, not taking much off, just pulling a smidgen off. And then I'm going to do my final 2 sides. Trimming just a little bit off. I'm trimming off less than probably a 32nd of an inch. So not very much. And that's what we want. If you're going to be trimming off large amounts, like 1/4 of an inch, then you need to go back and revisit and make sure that your seam allowances are the appropriate depth, that they really are 1/4 of an inch, that they're not too big, they're not too small, and that you've got all your pieces cut to the exact size. So this completes making one of the Ohio Star blocks and putting a frame on it. Next up, we are going to be making the spool blocks. The next block that we're going to make is our spool block, and it assembles very easily. Same way that we did with our 1/4 square triangle units or our 1/2 square triangle units previously, we're going to start out by drawing a diagonal line on the wrong side of both of the smaller white squares. Those are our B squares. And we're going to position them onto one of the I strips. And what I want to do is make sure that they are positioned in the correct orientation. And what we're making right now are called stitch and flip corners. So we're getting ready to do the stitching part. Let me grab a pin that's a little more friendly there. So I'm going to pin that one in place. And I'm going to put the other one on the opposite end, but I want to have the angles coming towards each other on the same side. Finish pinning, and then I'll make sure you see that. We've got it shown in the illustrations, but we've got our angles coming towards each other. We are going to stitch right on that drawn line. And you want to be as exactly close to the drawn line as possible. After you do that, we will end up with a unit that looks like this, where we've got our stitching right there. I'm using some contrasting thread, kind of a greenish color thread, to make it show up a little bit easier for you. But I have both of those stitched. Now what I'm going to do is trim 1/4 of an inch away. So I've got my cutting grid. I'm lining up my 1/4 of an inch lines, marks, right on that stitched line. And I'm going to trim this off. And we're going to rotate so that way we're always cutting away from ourselves. Trim that off. And now we're going to be ready to press. So we have done our stitch part. Now we're going to do our flip part. This is why they're called stitch and flips. So over here on the pressing mat, what I'm going to do, it would be really easy just to press this straight out. And you know what? If this wasn't white fabric and this wasn't dark fabric, I'd be all for it. But I want to make sure that I'm pressing this so that my dark fabric tucks back underneath. So I'm going to lay it into place, get my iron on here and let the weight of the iron work, and press that fabric out. And same thing here on the opposite side. Press that out. So now we end up with a unit that looks like this. For the center section of the spool, we're going to be doing just some quick seaming here, attaching strips onto the side. These are our H strips, and we're going to be putting them onto our G square. So we end up with a unit that looks like this. And then to finish out this block, super simple, we just take the stitch and flip strips that we made earlier, and we're going to put them on opposite sides of that center strip. And when we stitch them in place, we will end up with our spool block that looks like this. This also is going to need to be 8.5 by 8.5 inches so that when it finishes out, it is at 8 inches square. Because we've got fewer seams, I'm just going to do a quick measurement here and make sure that we're lining up. 8.5, a little bit over on that edge. 8.5. So I'm going to go ahead and trim up. Spin this around. If you have an 8.5 by 8.5 inch block ruler, you can sure use that. What I'm doing is working off of the edge there. Just do a quick trim. Spin her all the way around. And let me double check. And we're exactly 8.5 on that side. So just some little edges that I needed to trim off from those stitch and flip corners. And this completes our spool block. After you have all your blocks made, next we're going to be working on our border units. And they are basically the same stitch and flip strip that we made earlier. We use these for the spool blocks, exact same process. We're going to be using different colors, but we're going to just stitch them on the corners, trim them off, and then press and flip them open. So we'll be making a number of those that are going to be working into filling in our border on our quilt. As we're piecing our border sections, we'll be piecing together a strip using our K strips and then our stitch and flip strips. And we'll end up with this long top border strip. And obviously I don't have enough space here to lay out the entire quilt, but I'm going to take you through the steps that you need. And in your instructional packet, we have our assembly diagram. If you don't already know it, assembly diagrams, they're gold. They're just the best. But we've got the piece strip up here at the top. And then I'm going to be laying out my spool and my star blocks. And what I want to do is make sure that I'm alternating them in the correct direction and making sure that all of my spool blocks are going the right way so that we're doing an alternating pattern here. I'm just going to do an abbreviation of it here, coming back with a star, a spool, a star, a spool. But we would be laying this out for the entire quilt. I always recommend at this stage, if you've got a design wall, that works great. Just put all of your pieces out there on the design wall. Put them up first. Don't worry about color, but worry about orientation and placement first, and then come back and take a look. If you don't have the design wall, laying them out on the floor works great. Doesn't work so well for me because I've got a dog and she now thinks that this is fair game and that she gets to help with this. But assuming you don't have pets, or if you have pets that will leave it alone, the floor works great on top of a bed, on top of a table, anything that's going to let you just spread out all of the fabric or all of the blocks and see how all the colors play together. So if you've got colors that need to be adjusted, you can do that. One of the tricks that I like to do at this stage when I get everything laid out, just grab my phone. A quick cell phone photo works great, and just snap a picture of that particular quilt. Doesn't have to be a perfect picture, but it lets you see all the colors and how they're playing well together. And many times some colors that you didn't notice that were too close to each other, they really show up in that photo. Or if you've got a color that's really bright or something that's getting a little bit dark on one side, and that will help you balance out those colors. When we have everything laid out, we're just going to assemble into rows, stitch everything into rows, and then join those rows together. Really simple, really straightforward. We'll be adding the top and the strips, top and bottom strips. We have side units to fill in on each of them. So yeah, just following this assembly diagram will put everything in place, everything that you need for finishing out the quilt. When you get done assembling your quilt top, one of the really important things is that you need to give it a very thorough press. So make sure that all of your seams are either pressed to one side. If you've got a lot of bulk in an area, don't be afraid to press a seam open. Many times that distributes the bulk. And when either you're quilting it or someone else is quilting it, having that pressed well is going to be greatly appreciated. In your instructional packet, we've got the quilting basics, and that's going to take you through all the details that you need to know for layering, for quilting, and for binding. Binding is one of my favorite topics to talk about. So I'm going to take just a moment and show a couple little binding tips here. I've got two of my pieces joined together with a diagonal line. We're going to draw that the exact same way that we've been drawing all the other diagonal lines for the project. Line up the cutting grid, same technique as those stitch and flips. Just trim this off. And then we'll be pressing our binding strip in half with wrong sides together. And this is something that I see a lot of people have some challenges with. So just making sure that you're lining up those two raw edges. Let the weight of the iron do the work. Slow and steady wins the race. Bring it down. Making sure that you're lined back up. When you get to the seam allowances, go ahead and press those open. Distribute that bulk out as much as you can. And then we're just going to keep pressing all the way down the strip, making it as flat and as even as possible. That takes care of the binding, and then in the quilting basics, it's going to cover how to apply your binding and finishing out your quilt top. This is such a beautiful quilt, and I am so glad that you've joined me today as we're making it. I've had a wonderful time, and I hope you had a great time too, and that you've learned something new, because it's always important to be learning new things, new tricks, new tips, more efficient ways to quilt. Our time is valuable, and the more projects that we can get through in our time, the greater the reward of quilting is. As you're working on your projects, or as you finish your projects, I would love to see what you've made. You can share photos on Annie's Facebook page, on Pinterest, on Instagram, any place that you want to. Just make sure that you add #Annie's, so that way we can see your photos and we can share them too, because that's the beauty of social media, is getting to see what everybody's working on. Also, check out Annie's Crafts on YouTube for more video tutorials showing you all sorts of wonderful projects that you can make. Again, I'm Nancy Scott with Masterpiece Quilting, and I hope to see you again real soon in another Annie's video class. Bye-bye.